Is race something we can explain in terms of social and historical features of our world? I'm Дейвид Мигел Грей, and welcome to part 3 of our series on Racial Ontology, A Guide for the Perplexed. In the first part, we discussed 3 general problems that make giving an account of race difficult. In part 2 of this series, I looked at a particular set of theories we can call naturalist theories of race. In part 3, we will look at different kind of theory that places social and historical properties at the center of our concept of race. Given the complexity of this topic, part 3 will have 2 sections. In the first section, I'll discuss just what it means to think of things in the world as socially constructed categories. In the second section, we will look at features common to socio-historical theories of race, as well as some examples of socio-historical properties. Social properties are those that are dependent on human actions and decisions, as opposed to physical properties which are not dependent on such actions and decisions. In the last video, I used the example of the Great Sphinx of Giza to clarify the distinction between physical and social properties. The property of being made of limestone is a natural property of the statue. Limestone isn't something that is the result of human actions or decision-making, even if we classified it as limestone. However, the fact that this object is a statue is not a natural property. The fact that the limestone is in the shape of a crouching sphinx is the result of human actions and decision-making. To simplify things, let's take limestone, which is primarily calcium carbonate, and call that a natural kind. Let's call statues a social kind. Before moving on, I want to make the following 2 clarifications. First, someone might think that since we label and classify virtually everything we encounter, everything is the result of human actions and decisions. It is true that if we didn't exist, there would be no labeling of things. But the issue for us is whether or not the distinctions we draw when we categorize and label things are already there in nature or the result of human history and social institutions. For instance, we might ask, if human categorization never occurred, would there still be electrons in elephants or gravity in gold? Now contrast that question with, if human categorization never occurred, would there be cups in card games or planets in paperweights? I think the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is no. The mere fact that we do categorize people into races doesn't settle the issue of whether or not races are a natural or social kind. The second clarification I want to make is that an individual object may not be classified as just a natural kind or just a social kind. Like our Sphinx example, we can talk about the object as falling into the natural kind limestone as well as the social kind statue. Given this, someone who thinks races are socio-historical constructions could think that an individual person falls into a natural kind like Homo sapiens, while falling into a social kind, which is a racial category like white or East Asian. Defenders of a naturalistic theory of race would most likely claim that both the categories Homo sapiens as well as racial categories are natural kinds. Now that I have distinguished natural kinds and social kinds, I'd like to introduce 2 sorts of social kinds. Some social kinds are the result of us making things. Statues, stadiums, doctors, diplomats, boxing, and ballet are all things we make, and we can call these kinds of things artifacts. Artifacts are characterized primarily in terms of what they can do as opposed to what they are made out of. For instance, we would primarily characterize a coffee cup in terms of it being able to hold liquid and not in terms of what it is made out of. In addition to the things just mentioned, artifacts can be understood quite broadly. Political and legal institutions, money, and state-sanctioned gender and race-based discrimination are all the results of us making things. Other social kinds result from categorizing things that, unlike artifacts, are already found in nature. Additionally, these social kinds categorize things in virtue of natural differences, while the categories themselves are social. That might be a little confusing, so let me give you a couple of examples. First, here's an example from meteorology. Tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes are all characterized as low-pressure weather formations with accompanying thunderstorms that produce circular wind patterns. The speed of the wind patterns is a natural property of such weather formations and can vary greatly. We can characterize these wind speeds as being below 39 miles per hour, between 39 and 73 miles per hour, and 74 miles per hour or above. There's nothing special about those particular speeds. We just chose where to mark the difference. So these are cases of things in nature being distinguished in terms of their natural properties while being classified according to our interests. Call them naturally based kinds. Let's contrast this social kind with one that tracks a natural distinction. For instance, the precious metal gold can be characterized as having the atomic number of 79. Platinum atoms have 78 protons, and mercury has 80. Unlike tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes, the distinction between numbers of protons is not arbitrary, and is a distinction that we can find in nature, independent of our human actions and decisions. What I hope to have shown is that, in the category of social kinds, artifacts like teapots are quite easily spotted as a social kind, while tempests, like tropical storms and depressions, might initially appear to be natural kinds, but are grouped in such a way that the collections of natural properties are arbitrarily selected, making them social kinds. This point isn't itself just a tempest in a teapot. It is very important in understanding at least one version of the socio-historical account of race, one composed primarily or entirely of natural properties which were arbitrarily clustered together in light of human interests and actions. So one important question to think about is, could different races, say white, South Asian, and East Asian, be distinct natural kinds like mercury, gold, and platinum? Or alternatively, may races be more like tropical storms, tropical depressions, and hurricanes, that is, defined in terms of natural properties that are separated by artificial boundaries based on human interests and decisions? There could be several other types of social kinds aside from the ones I just mentioned, but I think this initial distinction is sufficient for us to go on and talk about different properties that social kinds have. First, you probably noticed that a lot of social kinds and social properties have to do with human interests. This means that when we create social kinds, they are often created with a function in mind. We make statues because they are beautiful, or to worship gods, or to express ourselves. We classify things as precious metals because we can invest in them or use them for trade. In the case of artifacts, they are created to serve a particular function or interest. While a coffee cup can't be made out of just anything, it needn't be made out of any particular material to be the kind of thing that it is. Similarly, by giving certain people properties like medical training, you make people into doctors and use them to help us when we get ill. But sometimes, things naturally have properties that we can use for other purposes. Take the Mississippi River. While the river has many natural properties, such as being made of water and having a certain shape, which changes over time, it served initially to determine the political boundaries between Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana on the western bank, and Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi on the eastern bank. The fact that it has natural properties which can be used as a way to politically divide some U.S. states is to use a natural feature of our world for social purposes. If you've ever used a rock as a paperweight, you've also used natural properties for social purposes. Okay, one last distinction. You might draw a distinction between social kinds that are clearly demarcated versus those that are not. Let's start with institutionally sanctioned social properties. Some social properties are the result of consensus by those in power. Being a doctor or being naturalized citizens are dependent upon the events of passing exams or being sworn in as a citizen, respectively. Being a doctor or being a naturalized citizen are also the result of the institutions which create these categories and make such events possible. Similarly, the rules of sports and the rules of the road are not up for debate, even though their respective governing bodies could decide to change the rules. Let's now contrast these social kinds, which are the result of formalized institutions and practices, with three sorts of social kinds around which there may be debate. First, whether we are considered fashionable or not is not the result of state-sanctioned institutions or even widespread agreement among the fashion community. While we sometimes joke about the fashion police and often agree about what is unfashionable, there could be reasonable debate over whether or not someone is fashionable. The same goes for other social properties like being weird, wise, talented, or tormented. Second, there are social kinds and social properties which result unintentionally from social practices, regardless of whether they are the result of formalized institutions or not. Accelerated global warming might be one example. Third, social kinds and properties can also be the result of covert or at least not easily recognizable social practices. These might include seeing the disparity in sentencing for crack versus cocaine possession as racist, the persistence of Jim Crow-style laws in America, and the social underpinnings of the gender wage gap. Let's recap. First, we introduced the distinction between natural kinds like gold or limestone and social kinds like statues and doctors. Second, we introduced a distinction between social kinds which might be artifacts and those that might be naturally based kinds, while noting that there could be other social kinds that we haven't covered. Third, we know that many social kinds are used for some purpose or function. Fourth, we noted that while there is a lot of consensus concerning some social kinds, properties, and practices, others are much more disputed. And finally, we noted that in cases where we are disputing what social kinds there are, or need to uncover social properties, kinds, and practices, there is important investigative work that needs to be done by people who work within the relevant social domains, such as sociologists, historians, legal scholars, and philosophers. This raises two problems for our first video, the domain problem and the expertise and deference problem. If it turns out that races are socio-historical kinds, in virtue of having socio-historical properties, then part of the domain of race studies will need to fall within the fields outside of the natural sciences. But if this is so, we still need to figure out what type of social kinds races are.